Okay, thank you very much, Gavin. Good, thank you. Well, thanks for facilitating this this visit and making it possible. My first time in Iceland. Thrilled to be here and having a wonderful time traveling around. Had a couple of days in Reykjavik. Yesterday went to the amazing cathedral and discovered the Icelandic punk museum, which I thought was just wonderful. So yeah, I've had a great time, and thank you for the extending the invitation to me to come and talk about this book, which is coming out on the 2nd of May. Wicked Problems for Archaeologists. And I suppose the context for this really is the fact that certainly in the UK, and I think more broadly as well, you probably all be very familiar with this, the cultural sector and archaeology in particular are coming under a bit of fire, considered by some to be somehow not relevant or some sort of a luxury discipline that isn't really that important. And we can afford, where cuts need to be made, we can afford to let services go. This is happening in universities in the UK, where departments have been closed down or are under threat of closure. It's happening within the planning system in the UK, where the old polluter pays principle, where archaeologists are able to go in, paid for by the developer, and undertake work in advance of a new construction, for example. That's coming under scrutiny increasingly. And cultural services within local authorities, where they provide provision through libraries and museums, for example, those are also coming under threat of severe cuts, and some areas in the country have been really badly hit very recently, like in Birmingham, for instance. So there's a big question mark about the relevance of archaeology and of cultural heritage. And this book isn't a response to that, but it was written around the same time that all of this was happening. And it's been a question I've had in the back of my mind, or at the forefront of my mind, for a long time. So in one way or another, it's quite a timely publication, I guess. So the story begins actually not with an archaeologist at all, but with an economist, Richard Nelson, who in 1977 wrote a book called The Moon and the Ghetto. Ghetto isn't a term that we would choose to use anymore for its racial connotations, but it is the title of the book that he published, and he was really interested in this dilemma that we seem to have no problem at all landing somebody on the moon, yet we don't seem to be able to resolve problems like, for example, poverty and generally urban problems, which came to be described as wicked problems. And I'll come on to that definition in a moment. But Richard Nelson really sort of made this point and made it quite public, that there is this dilemma, I suppose, and he was questioning why this should be the case. And yes, there are economic and political reasons for that, but there's more to it than that. It's a little bit more complicated than that, as I will explain in this presentation. So I'm going to talk about, first of all, probably about 20 minutes or so, I'm going to talk about some of the theoretical background to this, the theory around wicked problems, the idea of small wins, some of the advantages of that, but also some of the disadvantages of it. And I'm going to talk about the role of a group of people who are referred to as policy entrepreneurs. The term that's often used for these people now, particularly with young people, is influencers. But they're not quite the same thing, but there is an overlap between those two roles. And then I'm going to come on for the second part of the talk to talk you through three, only very briefly, but three examples, one on health and well-being, one on planetary health, which involves climate change and environmental pollution, although I'm going to focus on environmental pollution, and social injustice. And then I'll just say a few words at the end about how the kind of projects that I'm describing can feed into policy and therefore start to address some of these wicked problems through the small wins that I'm advocating. So that's the structure, and I think I've got about 45 minutes or so, isn't that right? Yeah. So let's deal with the first part first then, and I'm going to rattle through some of this simply because of the time that I have available. I'm trying to stand relatively still so I'm near the microphone. So if there's any, if people can't hear me, whether online or in the room, if you could put a hand up or say something, that would be great. I'll try and stand closer to the mic. So it all begins in the 1960s. So this is a number of years before Richard Nelson's book, in fact, when Horst Rittel, who was a mathematician, and Mel Weber, who was a city planner, both based at the University of Berkeley, they received a grant from NASA. So there's the moon coming into this story again, to see how some of the technologies being developed for the space program could be used to address other types of problems, such as the urban problems that I've already referred to. So it's a research grant, basically, that started all of this off. And as part of that research grant, Rittel and Weber set up a research seminar series. And it was in one of those seminars, in that seminar series, that the idea of wicked problems first emerged, in a conversation following a presentation, not even in the main body of the presentation. One of the people in the audience was responding to the types of problems that had been discussed in the seminar and said, those sound like wicked problems to me. And that's where the term originated and where this whole area of scholarship first emerged. So wicked problems are those types of problems, and this is a quote from Rittel, from Horst Rittel. And these are the types of problems which are ill formulated, where the information is confusing, where there are many clients and decision makers with conflicting values, and where the ramifications in the whole system are thoroughly confusing. So if you apply that combination of terms to something like climate change, for instance, you can start to see how it kind of fits together. Climate change is one of many types of wicked problems that for which all of those terms seem very relevant. In the original publication in 1973 on wicked problems, which is illustrated in that graphic on the right-hand side, there were 10 characteristics. I'm not going to go through those because we don't have time now, but those comments that I've just made, those phrases I've just used, they kind of summarize the 10 characteristics of wicked problems originally defined by Rittel and Weber. And then there have been a series of other publications subsequently which have identified additional characteristics, such as the fact that these problems are socially and politically complex, for example. If you represent this as a mind map, and there are many online, if you put wicked problems mind map into Google, you'll come up with, there'll be hundreds of them. This is just one that I've taken off a Google search, but it kind of does illustrate for me very clearly the complexity and the difficulty with wicked problems, and how enmeshed they are by their very nature. So you could just read some of the terms on there, and you can start to see how complicated it all is. But there's also something called super wicked problems, and super wicked problems are those which are even more complex and, importantly, even more pressing, because time is running out. We just haven't got the time to think about and try to find solutions to these things. We've got to do it now, otherwise it's simply going to be too late. And the obvious example again there is probably climate change. So time is running out is a characteristic of super wicked problems. There's no central authority, or only a weak central authority, to manage this problem. And the same actors causing the problem are also required to try to solve the problem. So these are another series of characteristics, if you like, that set super wicked problems apart even from wicked problems. I'm telling you all this really just to give you a flavour of the language that's used, particularly by policymakers, but actually much more widely than that. And I will show you an illustration in a minute which demonstrates how widely some of this language is used. It's not a terminology that I've noticed being used at all within archaeology or within cultural heritage discourse, to my knowledge. Maybe there are some papers that have addressed it, but I've not come across them. This is another graphic from another publication which just shows that these terms are not universally used. There are a whole range of other terms that other authors use as well. So we just need to be aware that different people, different authors, sometimes representing different disciplines, use different terms in order to describe more or less the same thing. So we do need to be aware of that diversity. I don't think that's a problem necessarily. I just think it's something that we need to be aware of. So, for example, here, there's the distinction between the tame problem at the bottom end of the scale, where the stakeholders are cooperative, for example, and the problem and the solution to the problem are clear, all the way up to what they describe here as very wicked problems, where the multiple parties are in conflict over values and interests, and neither the problem nor the solution is clear. And then there's everything in between. So it's a matrix of terms, basically, all of which one comes across in the literature in different contexts. So it is quite a complicated area to get your head around if you're trying to research this type of stuff. As an academic, I find this graph very reassuring. This is on the left-hand side of the graph is 1973, when Rittel and Webber's paper first came out, first time the term wicked problems had been used. And then it's the frequency of usage, basically, the number of papers that use the term, and then on the left-hand side, and the graph on the right-hand side is the number of citations. And obviously the two graphs are very similar. And the drop-off at the end, obviously, is the point at which the survey concludes. So there's nothing to be read into that. But what you do see is that from about 2002, 2003 onwards, there's a very significant and very rapid increase in the references that are being made to this 1973 paper. The reason I find that reassuring, of course, if you need me to tell you, is that after 30 years of inactivity, no one's citing your work at all, and then after 30 years, everybody's talking about it. And that's always good to know. Okay, so these are the different subject areas that have been using the term wicked problems, and particularly the Rittel and Webber paper. So you get a really strong sense here of the types of subject areas, the types of research which is using it widely, and you'll see some obvious gaps in there. So archaeology and heritage, cultural heritage, is not on that graphic at all, at least not in any obvious sense. But some of these subjects are using the term quite a lot. So environmental studies, there are 413 references, for example, environmental sciences, regional urban planning. What else have we got? Geography, urban studies, green, sustainable science, technology, ecology. These are all kind of, you could broadly clump all of these together probably under that heading of natural environment or the environment. And it's a field of research which is using the terminology quite extensively. And then you go down bottom right, you've got art down there. It's still being used, but not very much as a language, as a terminology, as a concept. So it is widely used, but it does tend to be focused in particular areas. And the other good thing about this is that a lot of these terms and a lot of these subjects that I've been describing so far align very closely with the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals, which you see here. You'll be familiar with them, I'm sure, but things like no poverty, which of course takes us back to Richard Nelson's Moon and the Ghetto again, zero hunger, I'm not going to read them all, good health and well-being, that's relevant to something we're going to talk about later on, affordable and clean energy, climate action we're going to talk about later on as well. And then there's all the issues that relate to social injustice in one way or another as well, so that features in there too. So the Sustainable Development Goals is a really useful framework. It's very widely known, very widely used, and the wicked problems literature and the issues that I'm going to be talking about align very nicely with that. It's also important to be aware, as should be obvious already, I think, that all of these problems are deeply entangled with one another. So if you try to find a solution or think you found a solution in one area, then there's a good chance it's going to have repercussions and influence elsewhere, and that influence won't necessarily be good. So well-known examples are problems that align both with climate action, for example, and social injustice, where by solving a problem in one of those areas, you're creating an unforeseen problem, perhaps, in the other. And this complexity has been referred to by some authors, including this person Akoff, whose quote you see here, as a mess. And that's I think a useful use of that phrase, because it describes very clearly what the problem is, that it is an entangled mess that we're dealing with here. So my question And the question that I address in the book is, how can heritage practice ever hope to resolve global challenges on this scale and of this complexity? And within the context of heritage practice, of course, I include archaeology as part of that. And the realization that maybe it can't. And we just need to be realistic about this. As archaeologists, we're not going to save the planet, but we can make significant contributions. And we can do that, I think, in 3 ways. And let me just explain briefly what they are before I go on to my examples. So the first is small wins. And I think it's really important. It's quite a controversial area because some people think that small wins are just not enough. We need to be doing more than that. We need to be more activist. We need to be more in people's faces, making big changes and enforcing big changes. But I think we need to be realistic. And I think small wins are an important way of making progress. So small wins have been defined as concrete, small scale, in-depth, positive changes, which can lead to transformative change as they accumulate. That's the definition of small wins. And they've also been referred to as small gains. You'll see that term in the literature as well, and nudges. And there's a whole area of theory called nudge theory, which relates to this as well. So it's gradually working your way towards something rather than necessarily trying to get there all in one big step. Psychologists have written quite a lot about small wins. Psychologists think it's a very good thing and a very good approach because it makes us feel good about ourselves. I don't just mean the individuals doing the research, but also as a society, we feel as though we're doing something at least, and that's a positive step. And we are making progress, even though the problem of climate change still exists. At least we're making some progress towards resolving it. The second one is by acting as policy entrepreneurs. And policy entrepreneurs, and as I said earlier, influencers is another term that's used, not necessarily for exactly the same thing, but it's comparable. And this particular quote, this particular article stresses that one can nearly always pinpoint a particular person, or at most a few persons, who were central in moving a subject up on the agenda and into position for enactment. And this was an example, I think this related to health. But it's a piece of work that demonstrated that the role of policy entrepreneurs was really significant in making some progress towards the bigger problem, if you like, trying to resolve that. And what makes a good policy entrepreneur? There's 3 characteristics. The person must have some claim to a hearing. So this claim can have one of 3 sources: somebody's expertise, an ability to speak for others as the leader of an interest group, for example, or have an authoritative decision-making position, such as a presidency or a chairpersonship of an organization. The person will be known for their connections and their negotiating skills. And successful entrepreneurs, policy entrepreneurs, must be persistent. Sheer tenacity pays off. So this isn't a role that's going to suit everybody. In fact, there's probably going to be very few people within each sector who are going to be well suited to performing this role. But I can think of people in archaeology in the UK, some of whom are already doing this kind of thing, some of whom are not, but could. And they are exactly the right people. They meet all of those criteria, those characteristics. Some people who meet those criteria and characteristics may not want that role. They may want to carry on just doing what they do and not have that responsibility. But there will be some who are comfortable with it. And I think those people are really important and have a role in this kind of setting. And the final part is through these, what are often referred to as clumsy solutions. So it's never going to be a neat resolution for this. It's always going to be a slightly messy, slightly clumsy solution. Keith Grint, who's a management and leadership scholar at the University of Warwick, has written about how one addresses wicked problems through leadership. And he recognizes that whatever the solution is going to be, it's going to involve individualists who introduce technical innovations, for example. So with plastics, for example, there are plenty of people out there, scientists and other innovators, who are doing things that are finding solutions, finding alternatives to plastics, for example, or ways of removing them. So those individualists are important. Hierarchists, so through COVID, for example, There needed to be people telling us what to do and what the rules were in order to get over that particular problem of COVID and the the abundance of PPE that was created by that is another example of one of those messy solutions. You resolve COVID, but you've now got another problem, which is the increased environmental pollution that the PPE created. And then you've got the egalitarians, the people who actually introduce change in society and encourage people to basically stop using plastics or recycle more or whatever it might be. So you've got those three different types of people, and all of those different types of people have a role, plus, of course, the policy entrepreneurs that we've already described. So finally, before we get on to the case studies, this is the way in which one manages, or one could conceive of managing, a wicked problem related project, as opposed to a normal project, that the kinds of things we'd be more used to as archaeologists and people working in the heritage sector. So if you follow the solid line down that graph, this is the standard approach that we take towards managing a project that is relatively straightforward. Could be an archaeological project, for example. It could be a heritage-related project or any other kind of project. But you learn about the problem, you analyze the problem, you develop solutions to that problem, and then you implement a selection of those solutions. That's what a normal project looks like. With wicked, and that's described as a waterfall model, where you just follow the cascade down, basically. The other type of problem, the wicked problem, is that it requires a very different type of solution, and it's the dotted line that you see on that graph, where you come up with what you think is a solution, and you apply that solution, and it doesn't work. So you go back to square one, as they say. So you devise something else, you try that, and that doesn't work. Maybe there's a couple of things within that are successful, but basically it's still left with the same situation, that the problem still exists and the solution that you created still isn't quite working. Backwards and forwards you go, experimenting all the way, until eventually, hopefully, you end up below the line with more solution than problem. And that graph has been referred to as like a seismograph for a major earthquake. These terms are kind of aligning with my experiences of Iceland so far. Okay, let's have a look at three examples then. So this is just three from the 5 that are in the book. So the first chapter in the book is what you've heard so far. The final chapter in the book is my final slide. And then there's a chapter on entanglement, which is about how everything is mixed together. And then there's 5 thematic chapters. And I'm just going to very briefly summarize those 3 here, just in outline, given the time available. So the first one is on well-being, health and well-being, described by many authors as a wicked problem, or a series of wicked problems that are interrelated. So in terms of small wins, what I've discovered through reading a series of different aspects of literature, so there's a lot of archaeology and heritage literature around this, but a lot in the health sciences as well, that there seems to be a very common theme here, which is that there's a positive correlation between cultural participation and health and happiness, and therefore also longevity. Obviously, there are going to be exceptions to that. This is a broad trend we're talking about here. So the more cultural participation you engage with, the more likely you are to be healthy, happy, and therefore the more likely you are to live longer. And there's a ton of evidence for that. I gave a public talk a few weeks ago, and someone stood up and said that's wrong, but didn't give me any indication of why it was wrong, other than the fact that they thought it was wrong. But I don't believe it is wrong. I think it's very right. I think there's a lot of common sense in it, for one thing, but also there's a lot of evidence from different studies around the world, a lot of it actually in Northern Europe, which suggests that this is indeed the case. We also know from a lot of work in museums that this is true as well. And I'm going to give you an example in a minute of this, where people coming into museums and working with the artifacts in the collection. So I'm not talking about the 3D printed replicas of artifacts here. I'm talking about the genuine artifacts within the museum collections, and handling and discussing those collections, and maybe even engaging in some citizen science and cataloging and counting and all that kind of thing. This is all really positive experience for people who have the opportunity to participate in those kind of activities. So this is the New Economics Foundation in the UK. This is a think tank that a few years ago now published what it called 5 ways to well-being. And these 5 principles, I'll just go straight through them. Actually, I'll put them all up there. I'll go through them one by one. These all make a lot of sense to me as well in terms of heritage participation and heritage opportunities, including archaeology. The 5 principles are that connecting is good, spending time with people around you, such as friends and family in everyday settings, such as work and school, but you can facilitate that for people who don't have those social networks by creating opportunities through cultural heritage activities. Being active, so obviously archaeology has a lot to do with that, whether you're on an excavation or whether you're doing some survey work. Taking notice, so being curious and paying attention to the world around you. That's what archaeology is all about, basically, I think. Continuing to learn, so the act of pursuing an old or a new interest. So, of course, archaeology and heritage practice fit very neatly into that as well. And doing something positive for someone else, someone around you, someone in your community, or even a stranger. So I think working in teams and just being cooperative and supporting other people who might be struggling with something that you understand. So I think there's a lot of things that we can do as archaeologists to provide opportunities for people and doing something positive for other people. And you'll see in my last example that I think this is particularly important for those people who need it most, who are also often the hardest to reach as well. But I think with a bit of effort, we can reach those communities. It's not easy, but it's worth the effort, I think. So very similar principles have been adopted by Historic England. In their well-being strategy as well. So I'm not going to go through this in detail because it basically says the same things as you've just seen in the previous slide, but it recognises that the National Heritage Agency in the UK is telling the UK heritage sector this is really important and this is something that's worth doing, and then demonstrating why it's worth doing and giving a whole series of examples of how it's been done well by often small local archaeology and heritage groups, with projects that benefit the community in one way or another, whether it's the people in the community or the actual physical place that constitutes the community, or both. So there was a whole series of examples on the Historic England website, for instance, which I won't click on and go to now because I don't have time, but you can just look at that online. And you can see a whole series of examples that are demonstrating this very positive contribution that heritage can make to supporting individual and community well-being. Talking of small wins, this I think is probably my favourite example of a small win, on the basis that it was done by a student at the University of York, not one of my students, but one of my colleagues' students, as a dissertation project. There was no budget for this at all. So this was done at no cost. And it was a project that happened during lockdown, during COVID lockdown. And it was a project that involved taking some Roman artifacts from Yorkshire Museum into a care home in York, where people, and you see 2 of them here, elderly people suffering from dementia. And of course, the fact that they're suffering from dementia means that one has to be quite careful about the way one approaches this. So you're not asking them to try to recall anything, but just asking them to react and asking them to think, just talk about what they're experiencing. And it was a terrific project, and had real impact on the people that participated in it. You can see on the screen on the right-hand side, the museum curator from York Museums Trust talking to these 2 ladies who are handling these Roman artifacts. So it's a really neat. I mean, there's no quantified assessment of long-term of how this has benefited them, but you can just see. You can't see their faces in that picture. That's been deliberately. That image has been deliberately chosen to not show their faces, but they had a lovely time. They were very happy doing this. There was a lot of smiling and a lot of laughter going on while this project was underway. So in terms of the immediate response, the immediate reaction, it was very positive. Long term, I'm not sure, but one assumes that there'll be some longer term benefit at least. And another well-known project in the UK, at least, is the prize-winning Operation Nightingale, which is working with servicemen who are suffering both from physical and mental health issues as a result of their service careers, and they're being rehabilitated, often to bring them back to a state where they can serve again in a military capacity, but often not. So some of them have actually been they've either retired or they've been invalided out of the service, but they still benefit from these experiences. And archaeology is particularly good for them because it's something that it resonates with them. It's about discipline. It's about being out of doors. It's about camaraderie. It's about having an operation to engage with and to deal with, which has an objective. All these kind of things that military personnel are very well used to, and it's just proved incredibly popular amongst servicemen, but also it's had demonstrable positive impact on their health and mental health. So in this particular case, there is proof that this is a project that works. So again, you can find plenty about that online as well. I'll just put Operation Nightingale into Google and you'll come up with a whole series of things, including videos and interviews with people that have been involved in the project. So the second example is planetary health. So this bar chart that you see on the screen just shows you, going from left to right, the global primary plastic production, which is 270 million tons a year, if you can't read the numbers on the slide, to the yellow, which is global plastic waste, and of course that's cumulative, so that's why that is the same figure, and that's 275 million tons per year. Then we've got the orange bar, which is coastal plastic waste, the red, which is mismanaged coastal plastic waste, and the very dark red at the end, which is plastic inputs to the oceans, which is 8 million tons per year. So there's clearly a big problem, a wicked problem here with environmental pollution, with a lot of plastic waste ending up somewhere that it shouldn't be ending up. And there's a number of reasons why that's happening. Some people lay the blame firmly at the plastics industry and the production of plastics and plastics that don't biodegrade and all that kind of thing. Some people lay the blame more at consumers, people who are basically the reasons why a lot of this plastic ends up in the sea is down to people's behaviors, and a lot of it is down to infrastructure as well, where the infrastructure simply, particularly in the global south, the infrastructure simply doesn't exist for people to behave responsibly with plastic waste. So there's a whole series of causes. This is why it's a wicked problem. It's all of these things are deeply entangled with one another. It's the one area, I guess, and particularly with the subjects I've chosen in the book, it's the one area where that archaeologists are most familiar with, because we're dealing with material culture, we're dealing with objects which all have a story behind them, basically. So rather than flint artifacts or ceramics or whatever it might be, we're dealing with items of contemporary waste, most of it, not all of it, but most of it being plastic. So it is a methodology that we're familiar with. We know what to do with these objects. We know how to record them and how to try to understand them and interpret the behaviors behind them and so forth. And it's a project that I'm now doing, but I'm one in a long line of archaeologists who've studied modern waste, going all the way back to Bill Rathje in the 1970s. So it's an area that I'm quite familiar with, and one that it's an area I enjoy working in. I've had the opportunity, the privilege, I should say, to work in Galapagos with a project that is trying to resolve this problem on a local scale. So if we do make progress with this, as it looks as though we are making some progress, this would be a small win because Galapagos is tiny, obviously, compared to the rest of the planet. But we are making some inroads here, and it does seem as though there are some solutions to the amount of plastic waste that's washing up in Galapagos, partly because we understand where it's coming from better, and partly because some of the sources, the taps, if you like, where it's coming from, are now well known and controllable. Some of them are not, unfortunately, at least not at the moment, such as the international fishing fleet that operates perfectly legally just outside the exclusion zone, and it's their plastic that's causing most of the problem. So we've done a number of small projects in Galapagos that are very archaeological, I would say. So what you see here is what I would call surface collection, what some of my colleagues in the same team would call beach cleanups. But it is the same thing. It's exactly what I used to do when I was doing my PhD, however many years ago that was, 40 odd years ago, 35 years ago, collecting flints off the surfaces of ploughed fields. and trying to make sense of, of them. Why are they all here? Why are there these clusters and so forth? What do these particular type of artifacts actually represent in terms of behaviors? But this is a beach, and I'm walking along picking up artifacts off the beach. Of course, they've been washed in by the sea, but in the ploughed fields, they've been moved around in the plough zone as well by the farm implements and so forth. So there's a lot of similarities here with what I was doing 35 years ago. But we collect all these things and we take them back to the lab, and then we were building these narratives around these objects to try to understand the stories behind them and where they were coming from. And yes, this is just a single part of a detergent pot, basically. But by trying to create a detailed story about that one pot and about 10 other artifacts as well, you start to build up a series of possibilities and a range of sort of narratives that explain where this stuff is ultimately coming from and what the behaviors are behind those things washing up on a beach in Galapagos. So I think this is a very archaeological approach to the problem. And then working with communities as well, you can probably see in this picture that most of the people there are young people. So that felt very important, that we should work with young people in particular. And you can see also that those young people seem to be having a great time, and they had a lovely time doing this project. We did pre and post surveys to sort of find out what they knew about plastic waste, what they understood about it. And then we were interested in how participating in this project will change their behaviors. Obviously, we need to wait a long time before we know whether this has had any real impact on those behaviors, but their attitudes, certainly from the responses to the surveys, are changing as a result. And then this is a related project up there. That's that map shows the west coast of South America up into Central America. And those little feathers, those quills that you see are the participating schools in a project that was, again, a COVID lockdown project where a number of schools, people at schools where the schools were closed, were invited to go to their local beach, find an object and write a story about it, and then upload it via an app. And then we analysed the content of those stories and published that in the Marine Pollution Bulletin. So this was more citizen science. This was obviously detached because of COVID, so everyone was doing this in isolation, but it worked really well. And it was a really nice example of how one can do a project like this remotely in a situation where everybody is basically stuck at home with nothing to do. And the final example, just quickly, is social injustice. So I don't know whether you're all familiar with the Faro Convention on the value of cultural heritage for society. I don't actually know whether Iceland has signed up to it or not. I'm not seeing any nods or shakes, so maybe no one else does. But UK hasn't signed up to it, but that doesn't really matter because it's the principles that exist within the document that I think are useful, and they're principles that we use within the UK quite regularly, even though the UK government hasn't signed up to this convention. I'm just going to rattle through this, but I think it's really important. So the Faro Convention considers the value of heritage based on the idea that knowledge and use of heritage form part of every citizen's right to participate in cultural life as defined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So everyone has the right to heritage, basically. Is convinced of the need to involve everyone in society in the ongoing process of defining and managing cultural heritage. Two things there: everyone in society, that does mean everyone, and the ongoing process of defining and managing cultural heritage. It's not a fixed thing, it's constantly evolving and changing. And by involving everyone in society in that process, we can start to think about and see heritage perhaps in a new light and see it through other people's eyes and different people's perspectives. Refugee communities, for example. And it recognises the need to put people and human values at the centre of an enlarged and cross-disciplinary concept of cultural heritage. So that's putting human values at the centre of it. It's not about things, historic buildings and stuff. It's about people, ultimately, and the enlarged and cross-disciplinary concept of cultural heritage. All of us who are involved in heritage, whatever discipline we come from, need to be much more integrated, I think, in the way we work with people from other disciplines to get the most out of this. But we do need to overcome barriers to participation. So I mentioned earlier on that it's often the people that are the hardest to reach that have the most to gain from all of these kind of initiatives. And I mentioned refugee communities just now. That's one example of that. And I'll come to another one in a second. But we who work in the heritage sector do need to put the effort in, I think, to trying to work with those harder to reach communities in order that they can benefit and feel all the health benefits and mental health benefits that I mentioned earlier on. So this is a project that I was involved in a few years ago with my former PhD student, Rachel Kiddy, whose work you may have come across, working with homeless communities. So that's her book over on the right-hand side. It's an Oxford University Press book, Homeless Heritage. This is the images show the kind of area that we were working in Bristol in the UK. She also did a project in York as well. And this is Rachel talking with two homeless men, including Punk Paul in the middle there, about their experiences of homelessness and about heritage. Basically, we didn't use the word heritage at all in that project because we knew that if we used the word heritage, they would think they knew what we were talking about, and they'd have been wrong because we were talking about the world around us and the landscape and the everyday experiences and so forth, not about the grand houses and the castles and so forth, which is what they would probably have focused on if we'd used the term heritage. So we were talking about things like the vase you see on the table, which Paul carried in his duffel bag, which you see on the table as well, that camel-coloured bag, and why he carries this object around with him and what it means to him and so forth. And the place where we're sitting in this photograph, what does this place mean to these people? So it was very much about those kind of everyday experiences for homeless people. And at the end of the project, Paul wrote this. I'm not going to read this. I think you should read this for yourselves, but it just gives an indication of how people respond to these, or can respond. They don't always respond positively as Paul did, but how people can respond to these kind of initiatives. Okay, has everyone read that? I don't like to read it myself because it's kind of his words, really, not my words. And then in York, we have this organisation called the Good Organisation who are running tours, and they set this up so that it's the homeless people themselves who are mentored by people who work in tourism and encouraged to create their own tours of the city, in a city which has lots of different options for tourism. But these homeless people are encouraged to create their own tours, which are on a historic theme, but also weave into that tour their own experiences of the city as well as homeless people. And then you book these tours online, you pay to go on this tour, and then they take a significant cut of the money that they get. And then the small amount that's left over goes back into the Good Organisation, who then reinvest it and encourage more people to take up this opportunity. But it works really well. And if you go on TripAdvisor and look at the responses to these tours, people really enjoy them. And then Larry Zimmerman, another archaeologist, anthropologist really, in the US, who's worked with homelessness as well. And he's written extensively on this around the 2010s, noted that archaeology can build community and social capital, can organise publics around contemporary issues. But identifying the problems to be solved requires collaboration with the people who have the problem. That's absolutely vital. We need to work with these people, not for them, not they need to be involved. They need to co-produce and co-create the projects that we're working on, rather than us create a project and then invite them to come along and join us. The homeless project I was talking about earlier on in Bristol was very much a project that we went with an idea. We would like to work with you, but what the project was determined really by the people we worked with. And to do this, archaeologists must do something that we're not very good at most of the time, which is share power and hand over the expertise. For once, we're not the experts. The homeless people are the experts. They live this every single day, 24 hours a day. We don't. So if we're going to be involved in an archaeology project around homelessness, for instance, in this case, then they need to be in charge. There are things we need to do. We need to facilitate as people who have the contacts, for example, but the initiatives and the ideas really must come from them. So just a few very quick conclusions then. I know I'm just run over. So wicked problems are very hard, if not impossible, to resolve. They do map neatly onto those UN Sustainable Development Goals that I mentioned earlier. Archaeology is one of those subjects that provides good data on a diverse range of topics that relate to wicked problems, such as climate change, environmental pollution, injustice, and so forth. So small wins are one way of achieving this. Some people don't think it's the right approach, but I think I'm quite a practical person. I think it is a good way of approaching it. We do need to work across disciplines. As archaeologists, we're very good at doing that. We've been doing it for years, so it shouldn't come as a challenge to us to work across disciplines. And I think archaeology does have the capacity to deliver meaningful small wins. And these are more significant, I think, if we can identify opportunities, policy windows, for example, and see those as windows of opportunity. And we did that with a number of the projects I mentioned with regards to COVID, that environmental pollution project up the west coast of South America, for example, was fitting very neatly into a window of opportunity. And some of us, not all of us, not me, definitely, but there are some of us who need to work, I think, as policy entrepreneurs and really try and push this message a little bit harder. Thank you.
So much, John.